Let me now turn to the ranking member. Mr. Westerman, you have an amendment number 7, sir. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several provisions in Titles 1 and 2 of this bill would place requirements on what would be the new sovereign nation of Puerto Rico. This amendment would strike these provisions as they would not be enforceable. There is no U.S. court that would or ever could enforce provisions in this bill that propose to dictate to a new nation how it should structure its new government. The U.S. Congress cannot demand that a foreign government hold a constitutional convention or dictate that they should have a constitution, let alone that would be included in it, or what would be included in it, or even require a new nation to join a joint transition committee. Those are decisions for the people of the new sovereign nation to make, not the United States Congress. If Puerto Rico voters choose independence, that is saying they do not want to be part of the U.S. federal system or have the U.S. Congress determining what they should be doing as a sovereign nation moving forward. The voters of Puerto Rico should understand that forging a new nation is not something that can be legislated from Congress. It's the work of the nation's people. These provisions have no enforceability and should be stricken from the bill. I urge support of my amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized on Mr. Westerman's amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Velasquez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What this amendment is trying to achieve is denying Puerto Rico's inalienable right to form its own constitutional government if the people were to choose independence as an option. The U.S. cannot deny this right to any country. We cannot call ourselves the beacon of democracy, while at the same time denying Puerto Rico's right to be an independent nation under international law. This amendment intends to set out for failure the option of independence, and I will never agree to that. I oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Hearing no further debate, the question is on Mr. Westerman, amendment number 7. All those members in favor of the amendment, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those members opposed to the amendment indicate by saying no.
No.
The opinion of the chair is the noes have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Chairman, I request the yeas and nays.
Mr. Westerman, having requested the recorded vote, that's postponed pursuant to prior announcement. Mr. Westerman, you have an amendment designated number 2, and again, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would strike provisions of the bill that require continued U.S. payments to the newly created foreign government of Puerto Rico if the voters choose either independence or free association. If the people of Puerto Rico vote for independence, that means they're rejecting access to the U.S. federal system, our laws, and our resources. Any foreign aid provided from the U.S. to Puerto Rico following its establishment as a sovereign nation is a question of international diplomacy to be negotiated between the governments of the U.S. and Puerto Rico and then approved by Congress. United States taxpayers should not be responsible for sustaining the benefits of U.S. programs to Puerto Rico if the people of Puerto Rico choose to separate themselves from the United States. I'll note that foreign aid is not just in the jurisdiction of this committee, which is essentially what these block grant payments would be. Any foreign aid to a new nation should be negotiated with the United States, recommended by the federal agencies charged with this task, such as the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development, and considered by the congressional committees with the jurisdiction and expertise to effectively analyze the issue. If the people of Puerto Rico vote for sovereignty and free association, that is still a vote for separating from the United States. The United States has always negotiated compacts with nations in free association. The terms of those compacts for economic payments, common defense provisions, and travel and work authorizations have always resulted from a bilateral process between the United States and the freely associated state. We cannot bind the outcomes of international negotiations and agreements with a sovereign state before such agreements have been negotiated, and we certainly cannot bind a new foreign government through U.S. legislation. This is definitely putting the cart before the horse. I urge support of my amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady's recognized.
thank you. In the 1950s, low-income Puerto Rican women were used as guinea pigs to test the now widely used birth control pill. As Professor Gabriela Soto Laviaga from Harvard once said, because of its semi-colonial status with the U.S., the ability to test on these women's bodies seemed like these territories are an extension of us. And from 1956 to 1957, and from 1966 to 1968, Puerto Rico was home to the storage and testing of the Agent Orange. Military practices in the island of Vieques and Culebra that have destroyed part of the ecosystem. And what about Ponce massacre in 1937? I could go on and on throughout the decades, citing the abuse and neglect that the U.S. has inflicted upon the island. But let's focus on recent memory. In 2017, the failure and indifference of the federal government resulted in more than 5,000 Puerto Ricans dying in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Ensuring a transfer of block grants and other federal allocations under the independence and free association options is quite literally the bare minimum. If we want to get serious about righting the wrongs of colonial rule, we will openly be discussing reparations. What this bill aims to accomplish, or this amendment, is to give Puerto Ricans, if they choose independence or free association, the tools and timetable to transition to international sovereignty by standing on their own 2 feet. I strongly oppose this amendment, and I urge members to vote no. I yield back.
Anyone else? Hearing no further debate on the question is now on the Westerman Amendment number 2. Again, all those members in favor of the amendment, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those members opposed, please indicate by saying no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I request the yeas and nays.
Gentleman has requested a recorded vote, postponed as per previous announcement. Representative Tiffany, you have an amendment designated number 10, sir, and you're recognized.
Okay, this is amendment number 10.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would remove the travel and work authorization provisions should Puerto Rico choose to implement either the status of independence or sovereignty in free association. From what I read in the bill, citizens of a new nation of Puerto Rico will be able to travel and work in the United States for either a set period of 25 years under the independence option or for the duration of the first articles of free association under the free association status option. That seems like special terms for a foreign nation that should go through a vetting process with the State Department and maybe the Department of Homeland Security. At the very least, this committee and other committees with jurisdiction over immigration and work authorizations should be given the option to understand the provisions and figure out what the implications would be. From where I sit, if the people of Puerto Rico want to be independent, then that means there is no special treatment and no special benefits from the U.S. federal system. That includes for travel and work authorizations. And if a new nation of Puerto Rico chooses to be a freely associated state, then travel and work authorizations would presumably be able to be negotiated through a bilateral process, as the other freely associated states have done. Any choice by the people of Puerto Rico for independence or sovereignty and free association should start them on the same playing field as a foreign nation, and then they get to negotiate with the United States. We should not be hampering possible future negotiations the United States may have to engage in with a possibly new foreign country, even with one that has a historical connection to the United States. The people of Puerto Rico should know that choosing to be their own sovereign nation means there are changes in how people can travel between the United States and Puerto Rico. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Any other member wish to be recognized on Mr. Tiffany's amendment number 10?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady is recognized.
thank you. The provision that Mr. Tiffany intends to strike was heavily negotiated in a bipartisan fashion, allowing Puerto Rico citizens to work and travel freely between Puerto Rico and the U.S. is an agreement that the United States already has in place with places like Palau, which, as this committee know, currently has a compact of free association with the United States. With this provision, we will not be reinventing the wheel, and as I have previously stated throughout this markup, this is one of the many provisions to right the wrongs that Puerto Rico has been subjected to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Amendment number 10. All those members in favor of the amendment, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. All those members opposed, please indicate by saying no.
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 Opinion of the chair is the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, may we have a recorded vote?
Gentleman's requested a recorded vote, and that's postponed pursuant to the prior announcement made. Representative Tiffany, you have amendment number 9, and once again, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This amendment would strike the citizenship transition period should the residents of Puerto Rico choose the free association option through the plebiscite authorized by this bill. From what I understand, this section creates an exception to the previous subsection that stops the extension of U.S. citizenship to children born in Puerto Rico to at least one parent who was made a U.S. citizen under Section 302 of the Immigration and Nationality Act after independence is declared. During a transition period that's only limit is the duration of the first articles of free association, U.S. citizenship is extended to some children born in a new nation of Puerto Rico, but only if they have two parents who are both U.S. citizens, as long as one of which has had the required residency in the United States under Section 301, subsection C of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Is that not already the case in our immigration law? And if this bill changes that, why does only this status option have a, quote, transition period? Why isn't there also a transition period in Title I? Perhaps the chair could explain this in the bill. I would like these questions answered. I think this further reinforces why this bill should have a hearing in this committee. And I'd like to see other committees with jurisdiction over immigration, tax policy, and entitlements, to name a few, to have input on this bill. As a member of the Judiciary Committee, I think it's critical for their analysis as well. It is a messy proposition for a United States territory where all persons are born U.S. citizens under Section 302 of the Immigration and Nationality Act to achieve independence and then figure out the mechanics of what happens with the granting of U.S. citizenship. We should know what the effect of these sections will be before we vote on this bill. From where I sit, if the people of Puerto Rico want to be independent, then that means there is no special treatment and no special benefits from the U.S. federal system. And Puerto Rico should not get a special transition time just because they may choose sovereignty and free association with the United States rather than just independence. All the other freely associated states went through bilateral negotiations with the United States to determine what economic benefits, defense provisions, and travel and work authorizations they would have. And none of them were granted the U.S. citizen status to their residents. We need to make sure that it isn't happening here without full vetting from the Committee of Jurisdiction. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone wish to, any further discussion on Ms. Tiffany's amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Velasquez.
thank you. May I remind this committee and the gentleman, Mr. Tiffany, that in the Supreme Court case of Afroyim v. Rusk, a U.S. citizen cannot lose his or her citizenship unless they are willing to surrender it. So it means we cannot take it away. Puerto Rico currently has 3.5 million citizens who will retain their citizenship under the Articles of Free Association. More importantly, ensuring that citizenship rights can be transferable for the duration of the Articles of Free Association was an integral part of this negotiation. After 122 years of colonialism, the bare minimum the U.S. can do for Puerto Ricans is to ensure citizenship is guaranteed if Puerto Rico chooses to vote for free association. In that event, it will be the first time in history that the United States enters a relationship with a territory where all its inhabitants are currently U.S. citizens. I cannot support this amendment, and I ask the members of the committee to vote no. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Westerman.
Mr. Chairman, the option in here for independence is unprecedented. If it were to be chosen, it would be the first time in history where American citizens have voted to form a country that's not part of America anymore. And nobody, I don't think, Mr. Tiffany, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I don't think he said we're taking citizenship away from anybody. The way the language is written is it allows a transition period where people who are born in Puerto Rico become U.S. citizens, and they wouldn't even have to have U.S. Citizen parents for that to happen. So in the event, I support Mr. Tiffany's amendment because in the event that the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico were to choose sovereignty and free association, this amendment would remove the provision contained in the bill that would provide a transition period. That's what we're talking about, the transition period for those born in the new nation of Puerto Rico under certain circumstances. The United States has laws that determine how citizenship is granted. Extending U.S. citizenship to those born in a sovereign foreign nation to non-U.S. citizens is, like I said, unprecedented. If free association is chosen, there should be no transition period that allows for U.S. citizenship to be extended to individuals born to non-U.S. citizens. This is consistent with the other freely associated states where U.S. citizenship is not granted to residents and benefits are negotiated through compact. The people of Puerto Rico should understand what choosing independence or sovereignty entails. That is separation from the U.S. federal systems and the related benefits. I support this amendment, and I would yield my remaining time to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Yeah, I want to thank the ranking member for the time. First of all, I'd like to associate myself with his remarks. And I would just also add the process question here. I sit on the Judiciary Committee. There needed to be a better vetting in regards to this bill, a more comprehensive vetting in regards to this issue to make sure that everything is sorted out. And I think that's part of the reason these questions are coming up here is once again, bill being pushed through that has not had that complete vetting, and that's unfortunate. And I yield back my time to the gentleman from Arkansas.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Gentleman yield. Anyone else wish to
Mr.
have any
Chairman.
comments on Ms. Tiffany's number 9?
Thank
Ms.
you,
Stansberry, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I stand this morning in strong opposition to this amendment and this entire debate about citizenship. It's clear the Puerto Rican people are citizens of the United States, and I've been actually shocked by much of the discussion this morning. As a New Mexican, I want to say unequivocally that I stand with Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican people in their right for statehood, self-determination, and the ability to determine their own future, their economy, and their political status. Puerto Ricans have fought for our military and died. They pay their federal taxes but do not have the ability to have their voices heard. This is not democracy, and this is unjust. Our Congress, this committee, have a responsibility to act now to join the Puerto Rican people in supporting their efforts to choose their own future, and this bill will create the pathway to make that happen, and this amendment is, I believe, antagonistic to that effort. As a New Mexican, I stand in full support of this bill. Our own state faced the same struggle for over 60 years. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed between the United States and Mexico in 1848, New Mexicans sought statehood for over 6 decades. And the same debates that are being had in this committee this morning on citizenship, on language, on culture, on history, were heard in the U.S. House of Representatives for 60 years before New Mexico was granted the ability to become a United States state. So I am shocked to sit here today and hear this debate. Our people were left in limbo for generations, relegated to territorial status as their lands, their waters, and resources were open for development, and our communities were unable to have their voices heard. So I stand in strong support and strong solidarity. This bill is long overdue. I want to thank the chairman and congratulate Representative Velasquez and Soto and Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon for your incredible leadership, and congratulate you on coming together to create this bill. And I want the Puerto Rican people to know that as a New Mexican, I stand in solidarity with your fight and will be here till the end.
Gentlelady yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chair.
Who seeks Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I think that every one of these amendments goes to the simple fact that this piece of legislation was not vetted before it was brought before this committee for a markup today. And that is why so many of the members on our side of the aisle are bringing these amendments up, because there are all these outstanding questions and we don't have the answers to them, and we're not getting those answers today. Again, I hear a bunch of explanations about why we should ignore the process with which a state is considered or brought into the union, but I'm not hearing a lot of good, solid reasons why we should be ignoring those. With that, I would like to yield the balance of my time to my good friend from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
So, Mr. Chairman, it's disappointing that the gentlelady from New Mexico left, because I was going to yield time to her for her to share with us what was the process that New Mexico went through. How many committees of jurisdiction reviewed this? What was that process? Because it sounds like it's the first I realized that New Mexico, it took 60 years. And perhaps you know that answer, and I would certainly yield time to you, Mr. Chairman, or anyone else on the committee if they know the answer to that. Of what was the process in New Mexico? How many committees? Did Judiciary Committee hear this? Did various other committees review this through the process of creating the state of New Mexico? It is not easy to become a state of the United States of America. But it's also not impossible, and there has to be strong processes put in place. There are good people in Puerto Rico, but you have to go through the processes in order to be able to make that happen and be able to answer the questions. So anyhow, I'll yield back to the gentleman from Montana.
Thank you, Representative Tiffany. And again, Mr. Chair, while you do not like the word of just eliminating or forgiving the debt, I know a lot of the people in this room would like to call the restructuring of that debt something different. But when I look at the taxpayers across the United States, and more specifically the ones in Montana, when we start talking about absorbing in some form or fashion that debt, I just was directed to come up here and oppose that. So with those final words, I would yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chair, this is McCollum.
Ms. McCollum, you're recognized.
I just want to make one comment. After the hurricanes went through in Puerto Rico, I went down there with a delegation to do some oversight. We would never have allowed the devastation and the continued lack of support that Puerto Rico received, and I heard from constituents and saw it firsthand in any of our states, we wouldn't have allowed it. There's still repair work that needs to be done. This is a big factor into why Puerto Rico is still struggling to get right. We had hearings, we did all kinds of issues on restructuring the Puerto Rico debt and everything that was going on down there. And we didn't do it in a way that solved the problem. That's why Puerto Rico needs to be, having this opportunity to vote, having this opportunity to get out from underneath the United States Congress, not being supportive of Puerto Rico in the way that we should with our fellow citizens, and continuing Puerto Rico not to be able to be sufficient enough with what we should be doing in Puerto Rico with our fellow citizens so that they can get out from underneath this debt. So we've been talking about debt all day. We've been talking about second languages and everything all day. Mr. Chair, I won't speak again on this because we've heard all these arguments since this morning. And once again, I am fully informed and I'm prepared to vote, Mr. Chair. I hope we can be moving on. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields. Anyone else wish to be recognized on the amendment? Number 9? Not, I will ask all those members in favor of the amendment to indicate that by saying aye.
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 All those members opposed to the amendment, please indicate by saying no.
No.
No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, may we have a recorded vote on
Gentleman
Amendment
requests a
9?
recorded vote on his amendment, and it will be postponed as per prior announcement. Representative Heiss, you have an amendment designated 45, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for not being able to be there here in the afternoon in person. I've got multiple plates that we're spinning here. But listen, I want to reiterate what was just stated yet again, that we've spent a lot of time today talking about the process of this bill, but that's important because the process matters. It matters a great deal. We have had 0 hearings about this bill. And as Mr. Tiffany just brought up so eloquently, becoming a state of the United States should be and is a process. It's not something that happens when a bill is dropped on Friday and we're supposed to vote on it on Wednesday. That's not the process. This is the only committee that this bill has been assigned to at this point, and we have not even had a hearing on it. And there are just a great deal of concerns, and I'm sure you're aware of those at this point. But this bill does not even give an option for those in Puerto Rico who support remaining a territory. This bill does not have the support of the Speaker of the House of Puerto Rico. It does not have the support of the President of the Senate in Puerto Rico. And why we are coming here behind this with such a rush and with such vigor is a bit concerning to me. Regarding specifically the amendment, my first amendment here, it would require that the government of Puerto Rico does not accept any funds from China if Puerto Rico chooses independence or free association. The thinking here in the bottom line is just to try to make sure that the U.S. keeps China out of our sphere of influence at this particular time. I believe that's extremely critical to our nation's national security, and we need to do everything we can to ensure that Chinese influence does not gain greater traction. So this bill just basically would prevent China from paying off the debts of Puerto Rico and thereby getting a foot in the door. And I would urge my colleagues on both sides to support this amendment.
Will
I
the
yield back.
gentleman yield? Will the-
Sure.
You have 2 minutes.
So-
I did
Why-
yield, but yes, if the chairman will allow.
No, you have 2 minutes, sir.
I just have
You
a
yield,
question,
fine.
an inquiry. Why just China, not adding Russia? That's all.
That's a good point. I would agree with you on that. This is something that I believe we need to debate and discuss. Certainly, China right now is having a huge movement globally, and that's why specifically I mentioned China, but I fully agree with you. Russia's involvement here likewise, I believe, needs to be considered and prevented. I would be happy to work with the gentlewoman to include Russia.
Any other member wish to address the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the amendment. The U.S. should not allow a territory to hastily vanquish its current status and assume autonomy only to see it venture from a U.S.-friendly territory to a sovereign that's financially beholden to an economic and military threat like China. And I would be more than glad to work with the amendment sponsor, Representative Heiss, and the other side of the aisle, Ms. Velasquez, to make sure that we do add Russia so that we can accomplish that. To be beholden to an economic and military threat is quite problematic. The U.S. must have assurances that this isn't going to take place. Furthermore, this will send a clear message to Latin America that the United States remains vigilant to the threat of China and communism. The recent election of leftist Gustavo Petro in Colombia adds another country to China's influence in Latin America. China has been investing heavily in Central and South America for years with offers on economic trade, infrastructure programs, and loans from its banks. And we do not need to see them spread their tentacles into other areas. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Hearing no further discussion in the amendment. The question is on the amendment, and all members in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
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 All members opposed, please indicate by saying no.
No.
Pending the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it, and the
Mr.
amendment.
Chairman, request the yeas and nays, please, sir.
Recorded vote has been requested, and that is postponed pursuant to the prior announcement. Representative Heiss, you have Amendment 46 now, and you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Heiss, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Amendment number 46.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This Second Amendment also deals with our national security and would require all of the United States national security assets to be maintained in Puerto Rico if it votes for independence. We have a number of bases in Puerto Rico. We have Fort Buchanan, Camp Santiago, an Army base. We have Fort Allen, an Army base, Coast Guard Air Station, BorihablamosTv. We have Coast Guard Station San Juan, and any other assets that the Secretary of Defense or Homeland Security believes necessary. We just need to make sure that these remain U.S. Bases and that we maintain them. So this amendment would protect our military investments that we have in Puerto Rico. The bases in question offer important strategic advantages for our armed services. The Coast Guard bases are key for timely responses to incidents that happen throughout the area. And obviously, these bases provide strategic needs for the area and protection from others abroad. So it's important that we address our military assets in Puerto Rico. And I would encourage, again, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Anybody wish to be recognized? Let me recognize myself on this one. I oppose the amendment and urge a no vote. The underlying bill already protects U.S. national interests, including national security, through the Commission, which will resolve these issues. If the voters of Puerto Rico choose independence, U.S. military assets such as equipment would continue to belong to the United States. Now, to the extent that this amendment requires that the United States get to maintain military infrastructure or bases, in an independent Puerto Rico, I believe that's inappropriate. It should be up to the nation of Puerto Rico whether they want to, if they chose to be independent, whether they want to let the U.S. continue operating military bases on their land, just like many of our allies do. This amendment is punitive. This requirement should not be preconditioned to Puerto Rico if their voters choose independence. And like I said, there's three options in front of the Puerto Rican voters. But this one effectively punishes one of those options by making a requirement that that cuts at the very heart of what independent and self-determination would mean if that was the choice. I urge my colleagues to vote no and reject Amendment 46. Anyone else want to enter into the discussion on this amendment? Hearing no further debate.
Mr. Chair, I will, if no one else is going to speak.
Recognized?
Thank you very much. I think this, again, goes directly to the heart of this entire conversation, and that is we're going to be put in a position where we could be forced to have negotiations with a country after they have voted for their own independence. And with your newly acquired legal experience that you were proclaiming earlier today, I would say that while I appreciate it, I don't know that I want to place our nation's security in jeopardy because of it. I mean, the Puerto Rico could literally vote, because it's one of the options, to claim their own independence, complete independence from the United States, and then we would be put in a position where we would have to start negotiating about the terms and conditions of bases and the ownership thereof, instead of addressing that right now. And that could be very, very problematic. I've negotiated many, many contracts over my years, and I can tell you, if the deal has already been struck prior to beginning those negotiations, it's problematic. That's like entering into a contract, signing it, and then going back to your legal counsel and asking them what they think about it. Legal counsel can no longer modify that contract once it has been signed, once it has been entered into, once all of the parties have executed it. And by signing off on this legislation without making a determination about how those properties and those possessions will be handled, then we very easily could be turning those over to an independent state. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
Gentleman, yield back. Who seeks recognition?
This is Mr. Heiss.
Mr.
I would
Heisel,
yield to Mr.
you're-
Heiss if the
You
chair would
already
allow.
yield back,
If the-
sir. I'm
okay.
sorry.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any further discussion on Amendment 46, Mr. Heiss's amendment? All members in support of the amendment, please indicate by saying aye.
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 All those members opposed to the Heiss amendment, please indicate by saying no.
No.
The opinion of chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Ask for the yeas and nays, please.
Mr. Heiss would request a recorded vote, I'm assuming?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Okay, and that is postponed based on prior notice. Now we go to, which one? Representative Heiss, you have an amendment designated 47, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, there's been a lot of discussion today about paying back the debts, and that's what this amendment would do specifically. Look, we need to make sure that we are taking steps to ensure that we are fiscally responsible in this country, and that would include if we are bringing in another state into the union. It would be totally irresponsible to admit a state into the union with the current financial status that Puerto Rico has. And I just believe that before any action is taken in behalf of Puerto Rico, the government there needs to prove that it has solved these issues and dealt with the debt that they are carrying. No other state, in my research, no other state ever that became a state of this great country was in such poor financial condition before being admitted into this union. And look, I was there years ago when we were dealing with PROMESA as well. And there's no question in my mind that Puerto Rico has made some steps towards trying to become financially sound, but there are still many steps left to be taken. And the Commonwealth there, the government, quite frankly, has a long record of problems that have negatively impacted Puerto Ricans and their future successes. So, look, PROMESA, we got through 2016, but we've got to make sure that debts are dealt with and that Puerto Rico is financially sound. After 6 years now of PROMESA, still they have not completed the debt restructuring. It's still an incomplete process. There's a lot of work yet to be done in this regard, and I believe it is fiscally responsible, not only fiscally responsible, but our duty in protecting the entrusted taxpayer funds of this nation to make sure that Puerto Rico's debts are paid in full before statehood is ever allowed. And with that, I'll yield back.
Want to speak to the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman's recognized.
So, Mr. Chair, I was listened to with great interest to the debate today. And as an attorney who has worked on any number of complex litigation and complex commercial transactions, I view that which I'm looking at with a great deal of skepticism. This is not to understate the significant efforts taken by those who have testified in support of the bill. I appreciate the need to do something clear and final when it comes to Puerto Rico. I get it. But as a lawyer who has spent huge amounts of time on matters dramatically smaller than this one, I am astounded at the lack of clarity as to many of the issues that we see on the face of the bill and the literally hundreds of others that do not appear here. And some of them are being raised as, with Mr. Heiss's amendment number 47, a good amendment and one that certainly needs attention, not unlike the one we just finished discussing, a good amendment and one that needs attention. But in my law practice, we had checklists. I don't really have one for creating a state out of a territory, but I'm going to guess it's pages long. And I wonder what was used to put this particular document together. It is shocking to me that we would be looking at something so important and so incredibly challenging on such short notice. It is a slap in the face to the people of Puerto Rico, and I mean it. And I'm not a person of Puerto Rican descent. I have every inclination to try to help the folks there reach a solution. But when I hear constant references to reparations as a kind of a threat to make us support this bill, I ask, where do reparations appear? Are they addressed here, or are they merely to be held out there as something that could be brought into play when the time serves, or something to justify that which is not already in the bill because, well, reparations? This is not to say that there's not things bad that happened. There are. But the question is, why aren't they addressed here, as opposed to merely vague references? If you're going to do this, you should be doing it right. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be doing it. Of course, this issue deserves attention, but it deserves the type and quality of attention that a transfer of 3 million people and an incredible history that goes with it. We've heard bits and pieces of it throughout the last several hours. So what I'm trying to say here is, as I've said about many other things since I joined this August group of Congress folk a year and some half ago, let's do it right. And I do not want to understate the work that you folks have already done. I appreciate it. But it reminds me of when people came into my law office with a document that they had put together, and I would say, this is a great start. But if we are serious about doing something that's going to stick, then it needs to be done with a great deal more attention, not just to the amendment that I initiated my remarks regarding, that I urge support of the amendment, and I yield my time to the extent there's any left back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone, is there any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady is recognized.
thank you. I strongly oppose this amendment. This is proposing to impose Puerto Rico a burdensome hurdle that has not been required for any other territory. And it also delays the implementation of this legislation. Requiring the payment in full of all debt on the date of enactment before any action can be taken, not even a vote, is a condition that has never been imposed on any territory. Why Puerto Rico should be different to that? If the people of Puerto Rico choose statehood, the legislation already provides that all debts and obligations of the territory and any judgments and settlements to which the territory is part will become those of the new state. There's clearly that language in the bill. Puerto Rico is already paying the debt. In the plan of adjustment approved before the court early this year, bondholders and the territory have settled already on a reduction of outstanding debt from $70 billion to $34 billion. And this includes general obligation debt, public building debt, retirement system bond, sales tax obligation, and water authority bonds. Power authority and highway authority bonds are now in negotiation as we speak, and debt service has gone down from 25% of yearly revenues to 6% of yearly revenues as well. And for the second consecutive year, Puerto Rico has passed a fully balanced budget, and the government of Puerto Rico has enacted legislation that enables the plan of adjustment. Well, a few minutes ago, I think it was in the other amendment, some people were saying that this bill does not reflect the views of the Speaker of the House in Puerto Rico or the President of the Senate. Let's make some data clear for the people that are here in the committee room. Statehood, let's say, the Speaker of the House got in the last election 12,000 votes. The Speaker of the House in Puerto Rico was elected by 12,000 votes. The Senate President of Puerto Rico, and actually the Speaker of the House is the Biden campaign chair, just to let that know on the island. And the Senate President of Puerto Rico was elected by 71,000 votes. 71,000 people in Puerto Rico voted for the Senate President, and 12,000 people voted for the Speaker of the House. 427,000 people voted for the Governor of Puerto Rico, who is supporting this bill. 512,000 people voted for me. And I do represent the people of Puerto Rico in this Congress, and I've been elected twice now because of this same issue of status. But let's forget about the persons. Let's forget about the governor, the Speaker of the House, me. Statehood got 655,000 votes. And yet some people here want to say that 12,000 votes from the Speaker of the House are more important than the will and the direct vote of the people of the island. I assure you, nobody in your district is going to believe that a person who got less votes than you is going to have more power than you. Having said that, the territory's current obligations will continue to be those on the new state or new nation of Puerto Rico if we let the people choose. None will be charged to the U.S. taxpayer. All states have long-term debts, and actually 20 to 30-year bond outstanding even today. Many states have underfunded pensions. Many have subdivisions and municipalities that have gone into bankruptcy. Are we going to declare Detroit is no longer part of the U.S. because of that? Why demand that Puerto Rico be free and clear before we even getting in? Why treat Puerto Rico differently? And for years, I have heard some of my colleagues argue that in any discussion of the issue of Puerto Rico self-determination should be put on hold until the island's economic and fiscal crisis is resolved. At least, this is one of those amendments. And I think this amendment is completely wrong and misguided, and I will tell you why. Puerto Rico's major economic problems are rooted precisely on the long-standing unequal treatment that the island receives as a territory. And this should come as no surprise, as any political or economic model funded on the basis of perpetual civic disenfranchisement and equality is not sustainable. And again, we can talk about FMAP, how Puerto Rico is funded just 55% when the rest of the states is 89%. And then we got half of the population living on under the poverty level line. And I'm certain that no single one of my colleagues in this committee will accept a territorial status like Puerto Rico for their own constituents. And yet I'm here representing my people, looking to have a final solution on our status. I know nobody of you will change the status of Puerto Rico for your district. I know that by a fact. Then why not respecting the long history of 124 years under the U.S. flag of American citizens on the island that are not willing to accept such as a relationship either? I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Anyone else?
Just one comment, Mr. Chair, if I could.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. By the end of 2021, the Financial Oversight Board, established by PROMESA, had completed assisting Puerto Rico in restructuring $33 billion in debt down to $7 billion, serving as the largest municipal debt restructuring in the history of the United States. One more time. One more time. By the end of 2021, the Financial Oversight Board, established by PROMESA, had completed assisting Puerto Rico in restructuring. In my words, that's forgiving. I know that you don't like to say that, but it's forgiving. $33 billion in debt down to $7 billion, serving as the largest municipal debt restructuring in the history of the United States. I think this amendment is very necessary. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Westerman.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to revisit some comments that were made earlier. I think it was a gentlelady from Minnesota on the Zoom seemed to be in a bit of outrage about the way Puerto Rico has been treated, and specifically talked about how they were treated after the hurricane. And maybe I can give her an opportunity to clarify that. I wish Mr. Graves from Louisiana was here. But I did a little checking on the numbers, and according to FEMA, since 2017, Puerto Rico has received about $68 billion in relief aid. And I'm not saying they didn't need it. I'm just saying that's what they've received. I believe Mr. Graves' state of Louisiana has received about $12 billion. There's members from Florida here. You've had some hurricanes and disasters. I wonder if anybody has information on if how much better the states have been treated in that regard than Puerto Rico, and if anybody would like to clarify what they mean about the way we've treated Puerto Rico after a hurricane. I'll yield to the gentleman.
Yield. It has been demonstrated, especially throughout some of the research and investigations, that President Trump withheld money appropriated by this Congress to Puerto Rico, just because he didn't believe that Puerto Ricans deserve all that money. So because of that, people die. Those are the facts. It's not about the amount of money that was appropriated or allocated. It's about how the president, and I challenge the Secretary of HUD in one of the hearings, and the IG also concluded that money was withheld.
I believe we also
Thank you for yielding.
reclaiming my time. I believe we also in Congress changed the Medicaid laws to allow more Medicaid funding to flow to Puerto Rico without imposing the federal income tax. And I still find it hard to believe how you can say somebody has been treated unfairly when they've received way more funding than any state has received on disaster aid. I believe New York got $12 billion from Sandy. So I just take exception to the fact that Congress, that the federal government has played favors with states and that Puerto Rico has been mistreated with disaster funding when the amount of funding is way, way out of proportion to what's gone to Puerto Rico versus what's gone to states who have had similar disasters. I yield back.
Any other comments? You know, Mr. Westerman, I recognize myself. The Medicaid adjustment was about parity. It was about merely reaching a level where citizens of Puerto Rico were receiving a level of parity with every other state in the union. And so that was one. And the response to the disasters, and there were compiled disasters, there were, and the money that was done toward disaster relief and the oversight that was provided here, I without a doubt, it was money needed. It was money late, but it was money needed. And so you're responding to a disaster. This is not a gift to the people of Puerto Rico. Oh, by the way, a hurricane destroyed almost everything that you know, but we're going to be charitable to you and help you out a little bit. This is a response that we make to American citizens and to territories and to states every time there is a natural disaster of which none of us have any control. And it was a response, it was needed. We all visited afterwards from this committee delegation, and there was every penny that was spent in Puerto Rico was deserved. If money was misused, it was a consequence of other kinds of corruption, but no. The money that I saw, the delays that I saw, and the effect that it had on the people there was tremendous. It was profound, and it's affected every recovery effort since then, including the economic one. So no, I don't think there's anything to compare to. You know, New York gets X amount, Louisiana gets that amount. Good. If they deserved more, they should have gotten more. But the fact, let's not make those comparisons, and let's not forget that this was a natural disaster over which Congress had no control other than to assure that the response happened. And I'm not going to relitigate what the previous administration did or did not do. That's history, it's fact. But I do think this amendment is not needed, and it creates a double standard for Puerto Rico that doesn't exist anywhere else.
Will the gentleman yield?
I was just going to yield to Mr. Please, of course.
Well, and I think you made my point, Mr. Chairman.
I certainly did not.
It wasn't our side that said that somebody was treated unfairly. It was your side of the dais that said Puerto Rico was treated unfairly, and we never said Puerto Rico didn't need that relief funding. Congress actually voted on the funds that went to all these disasters. But I think it's unfair to make the argument that they were treated unfairly as compared to states, when I think they were treated very generously, and Congress stepped up and met the needs with funding for the disasters that were there. I yield back.
Mr. Soto?
Thank you, Chairman, for the edification of the committee. A brief history on the economics of Puerto Rico. When Teddy Roosevelt was charging up San Juan Hill, Puerto Rico was mostly a small farm economy, where most people had land, they had their family farms, they were very resilient, and the peso was about at equal value to the dollar around 1898. And then they were conquered by our nation. 2 to 3 years later, after taxes were imposed on the island that didn't exist before the conquest by the United States, there was a huge consolidation. Hundreds, thousands of families lost their land to taxes they couldn't pay, and it was consolidated among corporations from the mainland. And it basically became a sugar plantation for U.S. interests. And for many, many years, people lived very poorly there because of that. Finally, there was the 936 exemption that was an act of Congress. And it all goes back to what Representative San Nicolas said, which is that with plenary power, the fingerprints of Congress is all over the history and rise and fall economically of Puerto Rico. So with the 936 exemption, that allowed American companies to pay just Puerto Rico corporate taxes in lieu of federal taxes. Again, a bill passed by the Congress. Huge amounts of manufacturing were brought to the island as a result of that. And Congress giveth, Congress taketh away. The 936 exemption was eventually pulled back. By then, Puerto Rico had over 3.5 million people, had been prosperous, had a broad corporate and manufacturing economy, and overnight, after that 936 exemption was taken away, half the manufacturing left for places like Ireland and other places. And so Congress, again, taketh away, and what are we left with? An island of 3.6 million people that has had half their manufacturing, half their jobs, higher-paying jobs disappear. I know, because that's why my family from Puerto Rico moved to Central Florida around 1996. And then from there, all these programs that they were funding for years collapsed, from SNAP, which they call NAP down there, to the Medicaid program they have down there, to the hospital systems. Mass exodus has happened. There was 3.6 million people there. There are now 3.2 million people. And so when we're talking about, and then the debt accumulated from there as a result of the 936 exemption being taken away, which was a patch in itself, the debt accumulated to try to maintain the same standard of living they had during that time period. But that's not what happened. Debt accumulated. Bad decisions by the Congress and by leaders on the island. Accumulated debt just to keep the same benefits and lifestyle that they had down there. And so instead of just addressing the debt through a bankruptcy, the Congress, again, with their plenary power, before I got here, decided to intervene once again with PROMESA and really squeeze the island. And so when we're talking about all these debts, note this just didn't come from nowhere. This is a result of many time periods, from taxes that crushed family farms to a 936 exemption that gave Puerto Rico an economic sugar high, to a collapse, and then people just trying to keep the same programs they had going after Congress took it away. A debt is accumulated. So the Congress has as much fingerprint over this as leaders on the island. So we all have to keep that in mind, and it goes back again to San Nicolas's point. Under the plenary power, we have an obligation to these territories. This committee specifically does. So I know a lot of you haven't had to dig too deep into it, but it's important to know that history as you're looking at that debt and you're looking at PROMESA and all these other things, the role that it's taken over the years. And all this gets back to the main point. It's a messy status for it to be a territory. This is the main problem, which is why we're here today. If they're a state, they'll be paying income taxes. They'll have 2 senators, 4 members of Congress. They'll get treated just like many other states. And by the way, this is a state that would have triple to double the number of constituents of many states that already exist. And if it went independent, it would no longer be our financial obligation. So if you really, really care about the long-term fiscal interests of the United States, this bill addresses them by getting rid of this plenary power quagmire that exists with it being a territory, and lets either Puerto Rico decide to break from the Union or to become a state and be fully participating both in its revenue and in its benefits. With that, I yield back.
Else wish to add to the amendment discussion, number 47? If not, let me ask my colleagues, all those members in favor of the amendment 47, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, indicate by saying no, please. No.
Oh. No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
As for the yeas and nays,
Gentlemen requested a recorded vote, and that is postponed pursuant to previous notice. Here, Representative Heiss, you now have an amendment designated 48, and you're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment goes just a little bit a step further from the one that we just had discussion on. The bill at hand does not clarify what would happen to the debt in Puerto Rico should they vote for independence. So this amendment would offer clarification to that issue. It would ensure that no matter how the people of Puerto Rico voted, that the debts to the United States would be repaid. This bill, as there have been so many comments today, this bill overall still needs a lot of work. I believe it needs to go back to the drawing board. Once again, I'm deeply concerned, as are many of my colleagues, with the lack of transparency in this process. The whole process is very frustrating. How in the world do we not even allow the people of Puerto Rico to vote to remain a territory? That is head scratching to me. I don't understand how we can come to this, but this amendment would bring clarification and require that regardless of the outcome of whatever vote Puerto Rico holds, the debts owed to the United States would be paid back. And I yield.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none. Sir, recognized.
Mr. Chair, we cannot ignore the contracts that are in place now. We cannot ignore the debt that has been acquired right now. I was absolutely thrilled to just hear my colleague from across the aisle, Representative Soto, recognize that crushing taxes are bad for anyone's economy, and I hope as we move through the balance of this year that he will embrace that concept as his colleagues potentially try to bring some additional taxation to the United States.
Will the gentleman yield?
In one moment. But the agreements that are in place now have not been properly acknowledged and recognized. And if this vote was to take place and Puerto Rico was to declare and claim their independence, there are still a lot of outstanding issues. And again, this has not gone through judiciary. It has not gone through the proper channels to make sure that they have been addressed. So I would support this amendment. And with that, I will yield to Mr. Soto.
I think I may speak in a bipartisan fashion for Mr. Webster and I. We believe in low taxes in the great state of Florida.
Amen. Thank you for that input. And with that, I will yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, I happen to believe that some people that don't pay their fair taxes should be part of the crowd that does pay taxes, but that's another subject, I guess, for another committee.
Chairman, we're still a donor state every now and again to the federal government.
Is there any further debate on Mr. Heiss's amendment number 48?
Mr. Chairman,
Who seeks recognition?
Jennifer, just to
You
make.
recognized?
Yeah, just to make and add an important data here. Puerto Rico paid $4 billion in federal taxes last year, just to make that clear. And all the provisions included in the bill handles how taxation is going to be in all of the alternatives, including independence, including free association, and including statehood. All of those provisions included taxes because the Joint Committee on Taxation actually recommended some of those provisions when we were in the talks and negotiations of this bill. So I just wanted to add that. I think this amendment is kind of like the same one that was just considered by the committee. But I need to add to something that Mr. Grijalva and Mr. Soto just said about the inequalities on the island. When we see the bankruptcy on the island for the last years, it's not because Puerto Rico decided to go into bankruptcy. It was because in order to provide federal mandates like Medicare and Medicaid, Puerto Rico was underfunded by the federal government to attain and manage those provisions. We just are receiving 55% per dollar, 55% FMAP of Medicare and Medicaid, because for the case of the territories, we don't use the same formula as the states. So that means that the federal government and the federal agencies can actually choose and select what is the percentage of funding that they're going to provide to the U.S. citizens living on the island. So that means that...
Would the gentle lady yield for just 1 second?
Go ahead.
It will be good to remind the members, again, the plenary powers of this Congress that gives and take away, because that was not always the case when it came to Medicare and Medicaid.
And reclaiming my time, what Congresswoman Velázquez is just saying is that, let me give you an example. Prior to Hurricane Irma and Maria, the FMAP for Puerto Rico was 55%. And I'm grateful during the House and the Senate, we approved to go to 100%, and even President Trump signed 100% FMAP for 2 years because of the situation on the island. But we went back again to 75 because of the COVID provisions. What that means is that tomorrow Congress can change that and go back to 55%. And what's the people of Puerto Rico is going to do when they don't have insurance for the low-income families that are living on the island? That not even that number is the same of low income that you use in Mississippi or use in Hawaii, because low income in Hawaii could be $30,000 to $40,000, but in case to qualify in Puerto Rico for those programs, it could be less than $15,000. Even teachers are included in this program when you go to Mississippi or Hawaii. The teachers in Puerto Rico cannot be even on Medicaid. What I'm saying by this is that in order to manage 10 of the 17 federal programs on the island, the government of Puerto Rico had a lot of debt and issue a lot of bonds to pay for those services. I'm not saying this is all. What I'm saying is our problems are deeply rooted in the lack of provisions for equal footing like the rest of the state in many federal programs.
Would the gentleman yield for just a moment?
Yeah, let me finish. To comply with federal mandates, and that's a reality, and that's the reason you see me here every time asking for a provision in energy and commerce, asking in ways and means to have provision for Puerto Rico, because in the case of states, it's automatically being approved. In the case of the territories, we need to have those amendments approved every 2 years. So imagine having a state like Puerto Rico with 3.2 million American citizens. I do the job of 4 members of the House for Puerto Rico. You just represent 750,000 of your constituents. I do represent 3.2 without the resources, without 2 senators, and then we try to impose the people of the island the responsibility of fulfill all federal programs without the money. And if we are not complying to do that, then we are incurring in debt. I agree with you in terms of the $33 billion and cutting to $7 billion. We know that we need to manage and continue to work in our debt, and I believe in low taxes as well. And I do believe in paying federal taxes as well. And that's the reason I urge everybody to see this bill as the only one provision actually allowing Puerto Rico to have all taxation laws like many other states, and I will yield to you.
Thank you. Thank you, gentleman. I would just like to say that there's no other state that has the provision that allows them to file bankruptcy. The states do not have that provision. So you are already taking advantage. Puerto Rico is already taking advantage of a debt removal relief that no other state has the ability to. And every state does have the problems with Medicaid payments and the share that they have to make as far as a matching amount, and they have these same provisions. And so all you're doing is making an argument from my standpoint on why it's going to be a very large incentive for the government, the existing government for Puerto Rico, to push the population to vote to support statehood, because it's going to be a financial windfall to make sure that their debt is removed, that they get full Social Security benefits, and that it helps them more financially. So with that, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to comment on 48? Mr. Heiss, amendment number 48? If not, all those members in favor of the amendment, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Thank you. All those members opposed indicate by saying no. No.
No.
And in the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is
Ask for the yeas and nays, please.
recorded vote has been asked for and postponed as per the instructions. Mr. Heiss, Representative, you are recognized for 5 minutes for amendment designated number 49.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have had a lot of discussion about debts and amendments in that regard. I'd like to change directions a little bit and talk about an important issue regarding extradition. If Puerto Rico votes for independence, I believe the U.S. must ensure that it keeps close legal ties with Puerto Rico. One part of that is the relationship, in that relationship is an extradition treaty. And look, this is, we don't need criminals hiding in a safe haven in Puerto Rico. We still need to have that relationship with Puerto Rico to extradite individuals who commit crimes here in the U.S. and vice versa. So this amendment addresses that issue, again, an issue that is not dealt with in the bill. This amendment would ensure that the U.S. and Puerto Rico remain close moving forward. And this is just one step in that direction. Again, I believe this amendment yet again illustrates the multiple issues that this bill does not address. I think we must slow down and deal with a multitude of issues that are neglected in this. And an extradition treaty, I believe, is one of those. And so I would ask my colleagues to support this, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone, any further discussion on the amendment? There's no further discussion and no debate. The question is on the Heiss Amendment number 49. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
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 All those members opposed indicate by saying no. 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 Opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Representative Heiss, you now have amendment designated number 50. You recognize, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This particular amendment here would basically say that any debts that are related to FEMA should be paid back. And I believe that's very, very important. We've heard a lot about the issues with the hurricane that came through with Hurricane Maria. I believe this is an important amendment, Mr. Chairman. I believe it's something that look, it's the American taxpayer that's on the hook with this. We understand natural disasters, and we are a compassionate people in the United States, but I believe we need to be responsible as well, and I believe Puerto Rico needs to be responsible to pay this back. But given the discussions of the day, I am willing to withdraw this amendment at this time, but I do believe it's an important issue that needs further discussion in the future, but I will withdraw this amendment.
Gentleman withdraws. So ordered. If there's no further comment on this one, we'll move on to the next one. That is it for amendments. We have a series of roll votes. Mr. Westerman, I'm going to call about so that your staffs and our staffs can collectively and notify all the members that we're going to begin the roll votes in the final passage and make sure that everybody that can and should be here is here. And I don't want anybody saying that they weren't notified that we had started our roll in our votes. So if you don't, with your indulgence, we are in recess, subject to the call, which should be in about 10 minutes. And I apologize for that, but last time I got complaints from both sides that they were not notified, and I thought we did, but now we're going to make sure. So thank you. Committee comes to order. We now return to the previously requested recorded votes. As a reminder, under House regulations, members who are joining us remotely must be visible in order to vote. There will be no exceptions for technical issues if voting remotely. Members attending virtually should also answer the clerk by saying their name first and then your vote. This allows the Cabinet enough time to switch to you, and it allows us to help reduce confusion and to actually expedite the votes that are needed on to finish up this particular piece of legislation. Everybody's cooperation is more than welcome. And let's see how it goes. The item is H.R. 8393. And the question is on the unfinished business, the amendment to the ANS. The amendment designated McClintock number 70. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will read the names of, the clerk shall now call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva.
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman. Aye. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano.
Napolitano, no.
No. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Costa. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablon.
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman.
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Heiss.
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez.
Leger-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher. Ms. Stansberry.
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes no. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no. DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl votes no. Ms. Brownlee. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, yes.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore.
Nope.
Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell. Mr. Soto.
Ms. Harrell votes yes.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto.
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert. Mr. San Nicolas.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
Mr. Nicholas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case. Ms. Conway.
Ms. Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
No.
Mr. Tonko.
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib. Mr. Han.
He votes no.
Mr.
Talib votes no.
Mr. Lee votes no. Mr. Han.
Trahan votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Are there,
Mr. Chairman.
are there any members not recorded? The clerk?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Let's do that. How is Ms. Brownlee recorded?
I can't do
Ms. Brownlee.
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Mr. Chair, this is Representative Porter. How am I recorded?
Ms. Porter is not recorded.
Ms. Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no.
How is Mr. Heiss reported?
How is Mr. Heiss report?
Mr. Heiss is recorded as a yes.
Mr. Chairman, Fulcher is aye.
Mr. Volter votes aye.
Thank you.
Is Representative Harrell recorded?
Recorded as a yes.
Ms. Harrell's recorded as a yes. I did not have a visual.
Gomer votes
So Ms.
aye.
Harrell's votes aye.
Gomer votes aye.
Mr. Gomer votes aye.
Any members wish to change their vote or record the vote? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 27.
The amendment fails. We move to amendment designated McClintock number 71, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
Napolitano, no.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa? Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
Sablan votes no.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Aye, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mrs. Radawagon? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? No. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes no. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl? No. Mr. Carl votes no. Ms. Brownlee?
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore?
Moore votes no.
Mr. Moore, no. Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Miss Harrell votes yes.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. San Nicolas?
St. Nicholas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia is a no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case? Ms. Conway?
Miss Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Mr. Chair, how's Mr. Neguse recorded?
Mr. Neguse?
Mr. Neguse is not recorded.
Neguse votes no.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Taco. Mr. Taco from New York votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Hand?
Trahan votes no.
Mr. Hand votes no.
Gomer votes aye.
Any member wish to record their vote? How was Mr.
Gomer votes aye.
How was Mr. Gomer recorded?
Mr. Gomer is not recorded.
Gomer votes aye.
Mr. Gomer votes aye.
Any other member? How is Mrs. Boebert recorded?
Mrs. Boebert is not recorded.
If there's no one else that wishes to record their vote or vote, vote is closed. The clerk shall report. What did I ask about?
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 14 and the nays are 28.
The amendment fails, and we move to amendment designated Westerman number 12, and the clerk should call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
Napolitano, no.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
No.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Aye. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
No.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal
votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves?
Graves, yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Aye, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber?
Yes.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
Get votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore?
Moore votes aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Ms. Harrell votes aye.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert? Mr. San Nicolas?
Mr. Nicholas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case? Ms. Conway?
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Lee votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Trahan?
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
Members do not wish to be recorded or change their vote?
Votes aye.
Who seeks recognition?
Mrs. Boebert? Mrs. Boebert votes aye.
Yes.
Any other member? If not, the vote is closed. The clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 25.
Amendment fails, and we move to McClintock amendment number 75. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
Napolitano, no.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
No.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablan?
No.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves?
Graves, yes. Graves, yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Heiss.
Heiss, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter.
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez.
No.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher.
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry.
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber. No. Mr. Stauber votes no. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
Get votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl. Yes. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore.
Yes.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell.
Ms. Harrell votes aye.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert.
Over votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
Mr. Nicholas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case. Ms. Conway.
Aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Tonko.
Gotta get my.
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Tlaib.
Tlaib votes no.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Trahan.
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
Cohen votes no. No.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Thank you.
Any members not recorded wish to record their vote or change their vote?
Mr. Lamborn votes aye.
Anyone else? If not, vote is closed. The clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 26.
Amendment fails. Now we go to amendment number 4, Boebert amendment. The clerk should call the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva.
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Costa. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Sablon.
Votes no.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman.
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal
No,
votes.
Lowenthal votes no. Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Gay.
Hello. Hello?
Mr. Graves?
Does Mr. Graves recorded?
Mr. Graves is not recorded. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Ms. DeGette?
Get votes no.
Thank you.
Ms. Duquette votes no. Mr. Carl? Yes. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Bobert?
Bobert votes aye.
Mrs. Bobert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas?
Mr. Nicholas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Case? Ms. Conway?
No.
Mr. Case?
Conway votes aye.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No. 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 No.
Okay, Mr. Cohen votes no. We did not have a visual, sorry.
An emphatic no.
Mr. Tonko?
A kind and gentle no from Tonka.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Tlaib?
No, Madam Clerk, thank you.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Mr. Han?
Mr. Hand votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Any member not
Graves
voting,
is yes.
record their vote or change their vote?
Graves is yes.
Mr. Chair, Stauber votes yes.
Stauber votes yes.
Okay, Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Graves votes
Mr. Chair,
aye.
how did Sablan vote?
How's Mr. Sablan recorded?
Mr. Sablan is recorded as a no.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, how is Tiffany recorded?
Who?
How am I recorded?
Costa votes.
How is,
Mr. Tiffany is not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn is not recorded. Mr. Lamborn votes aye.
anyone else? Any other member wish to record their vote? If not, clerk will close the vote and report. Thank you.
Getting too old for this.
It's getting late.
Almost there.
I know, brother.
They were going to have it. They told us they were going to be originally fully in person, and they switched it back to hybrid.
Mr. Chair, on this
My
vote,
guess,
If whoever,
probably.
I hate to break up the
Other members
conversation, but we're
probably
trying to
have their-
report a vote here. My colleagues wouldn't mind muting themselves. Not permanently, just for now. If the clerk will report, please.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 25.
Amendment fails, and we move to Mr. McClintock, amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Number 74.
Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will call the roll. Who seeks recognition?
This is Mr. Heiss.
We already recorded that vote.
I think maybe there's 27.
McClintock.
Mr. Chairman, I have
Clerk
another
will
issue.
call
I
the
want to
roll
bring
on
up, Mr. Chairman.
McClintock, number 74, while we figure out the question.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa? Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
No.
Mr. Sablan?
No.
Votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mrs.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes no? Yay. Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter.
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Webster votes nay.
Mr. Webster votes nay. Sorry.
Gonzalez-Colon votes no.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez.
Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher.
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl. Yes. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore.
More no.
Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert. Mr. San Nicolas.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
Mr. Nicholas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia's a no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway.
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko.
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Han.
Trahan votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no.
Any members wish to change their vote or record their vote?
Gomer votes aye.
Mr. Gomer votes aye.
Anyone else? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 14 and the nays are 30.
Amendment fails, and we move to,
Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Heiss requesting to be recognized, please.
we're moving on to another vote. Mr. Heiss, if,
Yes, sir, I have a privileged motion.
please, the
Mr.
gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just moved to reconsider Heiss Amendment number 49. I'd intended to request a recorded vote on that. Had technical problems on this end. We have made official requests to the clerk, and I would just ask your permission for us to have a vote on Amendment 49.
Mr. Chairman,
we
I
didn't-
second the motion.
Yeah, but what's recorded is the amendment failed on voice, Mr. Heiss, because there was no request. I don't know.
That's what I'm asking, Mr. Chairman. This is a privileged motion to reconsider that because I was trying and was unable to do so. So I just ask your permission for this to be added to our votes, and if not, I would ask for that to be reconsidered, please.
Wait,
So we,
I'm gonna,
and it's on talk 74. We're on McClintock 72.
well, I don't think it's gonna slow us down particularly. But the motion, that decision was already made, sir, and I'm gonna move on to amendment number 72, which is Mr. McClintock and.
Mr. Chairman, this is a privileged motion. It can't just be,
There's what? With the master. There's no such motion. At this point, there's.
this
no
is a
such
motion to
sir.
reconsider. This is a motion to reconsider.
There's no such
And
motion,
either
Mr.
we
Heiss, and we're
accept
moving to
or I'm calling
McClintock
for a recorded
72.
vote.
The clerk will call the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva.
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa? Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
No.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Heiss is a yes, but Mr. Chairman, I have a privileged motion. We cannot go on for additional business until that privileged motion is resolved.
Regular order.
We're going to finish this particular vote, and the clerk will continue, please.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mrs. Radewagen?
Neguse votes no.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
Leger-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes no. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
It votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl? Yes. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert? Mr. San Nicolas?
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway?
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Lee votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Han?
Trahan votes no. Sorry.
Mr. Han votes no.
Any members
Madam Clerk.
haven't recorded their vote or wish to change their vote?
Ms. Boebert votes aye.
Gohmert votes aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye.
Any other members wish to be recorded? If not,
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded? Graves, Louisiana?
Mr. Graves is not recorded.
Graves, yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye.
Costa votes no.
Mr.
Thank you.
Costa votes no.
the vote is closed. The clerk should report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 27.
Amendment fails. We move to Mr. McClintock, amendment number 72. Westerman, number 7, and the clerk should call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
Saban votes no.
Mr. Saban votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mrs. Radawagon?
No. Neguse votes no.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
Leger-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert? Mr. San Nicolas?
St. Nicholas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia is a no.
Mr. Garcia is a no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway?
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Han?
Trahan votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Any members not recorded or wish to be recorded or change their vote?
Ms. Boebert?
Votes aye.
Ms. Boebert votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
How's the gentleman recorded?
Mr. Graves is not recorded.
Graves, yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye.
Anyone else? If not, the vote is closed. The clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 19 and the yeas are 19 and the nays are 26.
The amendment fails. Now we move to amendment designated Westerman number 2, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablan?
No.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radawagon? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
Leger-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher votes aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry? Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber.
Stauber votes aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl.
Aye.
Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore.
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert. Mr. San Nicolas.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia is a no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway.
Ms. Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko.
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
No.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Han.
Trahan votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Member not recorded, wish to do so or change their vote? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on
Mr.
this,
Chairman? Graves, Louisiana, yes.
Mr. Graves is recorded as,
Mr. Graves is reported as votes aye.
okay. Vote is closed again, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 26.
Amendment fails, and we move to Tiffany Amendment number 10. Clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva.
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman. Aye. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Costa.
Mr. votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Aye. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablon.
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman.
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Heiss.
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter.
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez.
Leger-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher.
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry. Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore.
Moore, aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert. Mr. San Nicolas.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway.
Conway, aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen,
No.
I do not have a visual, sir.
Yeah, I think this video just doesn't like me. I keep, it's supposed to be on, stop my video. I don't want to push stop my video, so that means my video must be on.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
You look great.
Mr. Tonko.
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Han.
Mr. Hand votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Any members wish to record their vote not recorded or change their vote? And no,
How is Napolitano recorded?
how is Ms. Napolitano recorded?
Ms. Napolitano is not recorded.
No.
Ms. Napolitano votes no.
Anyone else? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 26.
Amendment fails. Amendment now designated Tiffany number 9, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva.
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman. Aye. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Costa.
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablan.
No.
Mr. Sablan votes no. Mr. Whitman.
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Heiss.
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse. Mrs. Radowagen.
No. Neguse votes no.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter.
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez.
Leger-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher.
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry. Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl. Aye. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore.
Moore, aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Bobert.
Bobert votes aye.
Mrs. Bobert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway.
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen, I don't have a visual.
How do we do that?
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko.
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Han.
Mr. Hand votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Any member wish to change their vote or record their vote? If not, vote is closed, and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the ayes are 17 and the nays are 26.
Amendment fails. We go to Mr. Heiss, amendment number 5. Mr. Heiss, before we get into a parliamentary debate and which rules rule, and this piece of legislation is pretty important to everyone. And I don't want to bog it down in a discussion. Benefit of the doubt is extended in the courtesy. It's not a precedent or a practice, but I believe you when you said your inability technically to get on is correct, and by unanimous consent, if there's no objection, we will consider Heist number 49 after obviously number 48.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Quite welcome, sir, but let me restate, it's a courtesy to a colleague, but not a precedent or a practice, because once the vote is closed, it's closed, and your motion to reconsider was out of order. We could have voted on that as well, but that just takes us into another time zone, and I don't want to do that, and neither do any of the members. With that, Mr. Heiss, you now have amendment number 45. It's up for vote. The clerk shall call the roll.
Good call, Chairman, good call.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablon?
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Gallego votes no.
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes no.
Yes.
Yes, excuse me. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radawagon? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yea. Mrs. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez?
Ledger Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mrs. Stansberry? Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Ms. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas?
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway?
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko? Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Trahan?
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
Be recorded or change their vote? Hearing none.
Gomer votes aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye.
Mr. Gomer votes
Thank you.
aye. Any other member? How's Mr. Tonka recorded?
Mr. Tonko is not recorded.
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no.
The vote is closed, and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 26.
I was checking. How did I miss that?
Amendment fails. We move to Heiss, number 46. The clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablon?
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego?
Votes no.
Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Heiss?
Heiss, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse? Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yea. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry? Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Neguse votes no as well.
Ms. Brownlee votes no, and Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Ms. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore?
Moore, aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas?
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Excuse me. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Vance? Mr. Vance votes aye. Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway?
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum?
McCollum votes no.
Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cohen, I don't have a visual.
Yeah, I hit something that was wrong. Are we okay now?
There we go.
Sending
Thank you,
your
sir.
video.
Mr.
No,
Cohen
thank
votes
you.
no. Mr. Tonko?
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Hen?
Trahan votes no.
Mr. Hen votes no.
Leger-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no.
Anyone else wish to record their vote or change their vote? If not, the vote is closed. and the clerk shall-
votes aye.
Except for Mr.
Sorry.
Gomer under the, who just squeezed under the line. How is Mr. Gomer recorded?
Mr. Gometer is recorded as an aye.
I will repeat, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 27.
Amendment fails. We now have Heiss Amendment number 47, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman? Aye. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
Votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablon?
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
Huffman's no.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves?
Graves, yes.
Mr. Graves votes yes. Mr. Gallego?
No.
Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Heiss?
Heiss, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radwagen? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yea. Ms. Porter?
Porter, no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry? Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto? Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas?
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway?
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum? Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Tonko?
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Mr. Han?
Trahan votes no.
Mr. Han votes no.
Any member not recorded and wishes to be recorded? Hearing none, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 28.
Amendment fails, and we move to amendment designated Heiss number 48. The clerk shall call the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
Mr. votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablon?
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman?
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Gallego?
No.
Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Heiss?
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radwagen? Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry? Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle? Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert. Mr. San Nicolas.
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway.
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum.
No.
Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko.
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Trahan.
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
Any member wish to be recorded or change their vote?
Mr. Chairman, Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye.
Thank you. Anyone else? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 17 and the nays are 27.
The amendment fails, and we move to Heiss Amendment number 49, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva.
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Costa. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Mr. Sablon.
No.
Mr. Sablon votes no. Mr. Whitman.
Whitman votes aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman.
No.
Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Gallego.
Gallego votes no.
Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Heiss.
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse.
Who's that? No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radawagon. Mr. Levin.
Phoenix?
No.
Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter.
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leisure-Fernandez.
Leisure-Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leisure-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher.
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansbury. Ms. Stansbury votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes no. Mr. Moore.
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Soto votes no. Mrs. Boebert.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas.
San Nicolas votes no.
Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Benz.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. Conway.
Conway votes aye.
Ms. Conway votes aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum votes no. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko.
Taco votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Trahan.
Trahan votes no.
Ms. Trahan votes no.
Any member wish to be recorded or change their vote?
So votes no.
Mr. Graves votes
Costa
yes.
votes no.
And Mr. Costa votes no.
Anyone else? If not, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report. Good Lord.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 27.
Amendment fails. And now, the question is now on the Grijalva ANS to HR 8393. All those in favor of the amendment indicate by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying no.
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 The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is agreed to. Now
It was they.
Now we have a recorded final passage. The question is on adopting HR 8393 as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House.
Chairman.
A recorded vote will be requested, so we will skip that voice vote and go directly to the recorded vote, and the clerk will call the... Sir.
I just want to speak for a minute. I'm not for adding another state. It doesn't matter who they are or what they are. And the reason is because when the 13 colonies came in, the difference between the largest and the smallest was was in the hundreds of thousands of votes or people. And then we began to grow and add states. And when we did, the disparity of all the states that have 2 senators became greater. And now it's so great that it really doesn't even matter. And it's sad that that is. So if you take the top states, top 4 states, California, Texas, Florida.
Sir,
and
the period for debate kind of expired on this piece of legislation early on. If we would close, I was extending the courtesy, but we've got the final passage and that roll call vote, and I'm impressed by my colleagues, as I should be, that they have other commitments beyond this room starting at 6 o'clock. So with all due respect, sir.
I'll be done in 45 seconds.
I appreciate it.
So California, Texas, and Florida, and New York are the top 4 states. Their total population is over 110 million people. The bottom 4, their total population is under 3 million. And so the disparity between someone who has a senator in one of the larger states and the one that has one in the small is huge. And that doesn't change. You get 2, and if we add this state, we'll get 2 more, and it'll dilute the people in Florida or California or Texas and so forth. They're going to dilute them down. And so to me, that's like 400 times the amount of people that they have to service and represent as opposed to somebody in a smaller state. So for that, I don't care where the state is. I just don't think it's right. The disparity is getting bigger and bigger, and they're not represented, and it's sad. And that's probably why people who talk about how bad the 60 vote rule is, that helps actually bridge the gap and make it closer by just saying you got to get 60. So anyway, there's my deal.
Thank you very much. The question is on adopting HR 8393 as amended. Ordered in favor, report it to the House. Recorded vote will be requested, so we'll just skip to that, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
Yes.
Mr. Grijalva votes yes. Mr. Westerman? No. Mr. Westerman votes no. Mrs. Napolitano?
Yes.
Mrs. Napolitano votes yes. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
Still votes yes.
Mr. Costa votes yes. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Lamborn votes no. Mr. Sablon?
Yes.
Mr. Sablon votes yes. Mr. Whitman?
Whitman votes no.
Mr. Whitman votes no. Mr. Huffman?
Yes.
Mr. Huffman votes yes. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes yes.
Mr. Lowenthal votes yes. Mr. Graves? No. Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Gallego?
An emphatic yes.
Mr. Gallego votes yes. Mr. Heiss?
Heiss, no.
Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Neguse?
Yes.
Mr. Neguse votes yes. Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin?
Yes.
Mr. Levin votes yes. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes no. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes yes.
Ms. Porter votes yes. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon?
Gonzalez-Colon voto sí. Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes yes. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
Claro que sí. Ledger Fernandez votes yes.
Ms. Ledger Fernandez votes yes. Mr. Fulcher.
Folgers, no.
Mr. Fulcher votes no. Ms. Stansberry.
Another emphatic yes.
Ms. Stansberry votes yes. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes no. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes yes. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes no. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes yes.
Ms. DeGette votes yes. Mr. Carl. No. Mr. Carl votes no. Ms. Brownlee.
Votes yes.
Ms. Brownlee votes yes. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, no.
Mr. Rosendale votes no. Mrs. Dingle. Mrs. Dingle votes yes. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes yes.
Mr. McEachin votes yes. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. Soto.
After 120 plus years, yes.
Mr. Soto votes yes. Mrs. Boebert.
Boebert votes no.
Mrs. Boebert votes no. Mr. San Nicolas.
Guam votes yes.
Mr. San Nicolas votes yes. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Case.
Yes.
Mr. Case votes yes. Ms. Conway.
No.
Ms. Conway votes no. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum votes yes. Mr. Cohen.
Yes.
Mr. Cohen votes yes. Mr. Tonko.
Taco votes yes.
Mr. Tonko votes yes. Ms. Talib.
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Trahan.
Trahan votes yes.
Ms. Trahan votes yes.
Member not recorded, wish to be recorded. Any member wish to change their votes? If not, the vote is closed, and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 25 and the nays are 20.
The bill as adopted, the bill as amended, the bill is adopted as amended and ordered favorably reported to the House, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Mr. Westerman, you have a motion regarding views.
Mr. Chairman, under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of my intention to file additional or dissenting views on the bill just considered and all bills considered during this markup, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members.
Thank you very much. And before I want to thank all the members of the entire committee, and I also want to thank respective staffs that participated in a very difficult and delicate process. This is a consensus compromise, and to try to having been here and not necessarily in this chairmanship, but been on this committee so long, when this subject of Puerto Rico comes up time and time again, in the past, it always seemed to be destined for failure because we made it something versus something else. And all the significant options for non-colonial status are in this legislation. And they're not new. They've been talked about for a decade intensely, and for the last 3 or 4 years, even more intensely. And so I think we've taken a significant step, and I want to congratulate the participants in that very delicate consensus compromise process. It required a great deal of political risk and political courage at the same time, and I want to extend to all of you my appreciation and my hope that as we move this legislation forward, that the intent of this gets better and better known. It is about establishing a relationship for the people of Puerto Rico that allows them to decide their identity. And I think that's important. I think it's critical. This last vestige of colonialism, it needs to be ripped from us, and this Band-Aid hurts sometimes, but this is the process. I also want to say one thing. The people of Puerto Rico, I learned a lot on the visits and the discussions. The people of Puerto Rico are honorable, hardworking, smart people. And what they taught me was that this decision is a difficult one for them. And in the past, if there was cynicism and lack of participation in plebiscites because they never felt empowered. That after they were done, others were going to do whatever they wanted regardless. Yes, this is binding, and it should be that way, because that is our empowerment to the voters of Puerto Rico, telling them the decision you make is yours, and the decision you make, we all live with. So thanks to all of you. I appreciate it. And those that are not happy with this piece of legislation, I appreciated generally your civility and your willingness to help us move this along. We intend to print this markup, so I would encourage members to submit their written statements as soon as possible so they're part of the record. And I would venture to say, coming from this committee, a historic part of the record, regardless of your opinion. And I appreciate that. I would appreciate those. Thank you very much for indulging me. And let me say, with the cooperation of the ranking member and other members of the committee, it appears we have worked out an agreement on 4 bills scheduled for markup today. Before we begin, I take a horrible risk in saying, does any member seek time to speak on any of the bills in this unanimous consent package? Taking that risk? Thank you. As we've done before, I'll make a single UC motion to discharge the agreed upon bills. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 6353, the Service Animals Memorial, H.R. 6799, the Parker House Study, H.R. 6438, the Deerfield Study, and H.R. 7618, the Holocaust Memorial in Ohio. Without objection, so ordered. I now ask that unanimous consent the following bill be adopted and ordered favorably reported as described to the House of Representatives. H.R. 6353, Service Animal Memorial, H.R. 6799, the Parker House Study, H.R. 6438, the Deerfield Study, and H.R. 7618, the Holocaust Memorial in Ohio. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider are laid on the table. And with that, all members have 2 days in which to add supplemental and minority or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent that that the staff be allowed to make necessary and technical conforming changes to the bill ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. I ask unanimous consent that for any bill ordered reported today, that with amendments that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike all after the enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted in committee. Without objection, so ordered, and thank you very much. And I thank Ranking Member Westerman and other members of the committee. And with no further discussion or business, the committee is now adjourned. Thank you very much.